title of our discussion, Life in the Old Dog Yet, came from an Irish Times editorial earlier this year after Morning Ireland poked this old dog with a stick by describing it as a sunset industry. There's the sun again setting on us. But anyway, Irish Times replied, fragile, yes, but casualties notwithstanding, there's life in the old dog yet. Newspapers continue to make a social contribution that outshines their imperfections. A great many demonstrate an ability to change, innovate and compellingly serve large growing audiences across print and digital spaces. And that hopefully is true, but nobody would deny that the print industry is facing extreme difficulties. That said, it's probably a debate that we could broaden out to traditional or old media generally, rather than just newspapers, because there's a whole generation who no longer tune into live television for their entertainment either. But we are going to start with newspapers because you've all read about it, even in, most ironically, newspapers themselves, that we're an industry in a lot of trouble with declining readership and particularly an alarming fall-off in advertising revenue. Before we get into our discussion, can I say this part of it will last for around an hour and we'll leave about 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience, but then we'll be whooshed out after that because there are people who know more about a subject called On Common Ground, an exploration of creativity and the use of public spaces, and they'll be coming in to replace all of us. But before all of that, I guess the question is this: was Anya Lawler right when she said that newspapers were existing in a sunset industry and on the precipice of complete demise? Or was the Irish Times editorial more accurate, claiming that there is indeed considerable life left in the old dog yet? Before I forget, can I just remind you, this is being streamed live on Gaff TV, so if you could avoid walking across in front of the cameras, that would be great, unless of course you want to be a television star, and in that case feel free to do so. So can I introduce our panel to you this morning in no particular order. I'll introduce you to Maggie O'Kane first, an award-winning Irish journalist and documentary filmmaker in this country, well known from her time with the Sunday Tribune and also with RTE, but most associated with the Guardian newspaper, where she was foreign correspondent, who produced some extraordinary work in Sarajevo at the height of the siege there back in the early 90s, and it's something I want to talk to her about, how much easier that would be today than it was then. She has been the editorial director of Guardian Films, that's the paper's film unit, since 2004. Will you give a big welcome to Maggie O'Kane? Now, John Mulholland is not a bookmaker from Galway, although, as I presume he's as narcissistic as the rest of us, must be delightful to walk around Galway and see his name up in lights all over the place as he moves along through the streets. He is indeed the editor of The Observer and a native of Ranelagh in Dublin. He's a DCU graduate and succeeded Roger Alton as Observer editor back in 2008 after 10 years as deputy editor, where he oversaw some of those fantastic supplements, the monthly food, sport and music magazines, two of which we no longer have. He also oversaw the change of the format to the Berliner that we know and love. Ladies and gentlemen, John Mulholland. And Mark Little is the CEO and founder of Storyful. He's instantly recognisable to all of us as the Washington correspondent for RTE, presenter of Primetime and many other programmes. He is the founder, as I say, of Storyful, which is best described as a social media news agency. He leads a team of journalists and technologists working with some of the biggest news organisations and social networks in the world, including YouTube, ABC News and the New York Times. And he'll tell us more about that. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Little. You're all very welcome, folks. This morning, it's ungodly hour. I'm sorry that you've missed Mass, but such is life. John, can I maybe start with you and on this one and say, you know, the Guardian / Observer has been very much the forefront of the digital revolution or evolution in newspaper terms. Are newspapers, as we know them, going the way of the dodo?
I think we need to go in the way of the what?
The dodo? You see, you don't even remember the dodo, so that just shows how dead it is.
I don't know what a dodo is, but it sounds like it's not a very good place to go. So if we assume that that's the case. No, I think we need to distinguish between newspapers and news journalism. Now, clearly, the economic market for newspapers is incredibly challenged. We know of all the stories about circulation in retreat across the world. But I think we have to distinguish between what is happening to printed words on paper and the journalism that we're doing. You know, a lot of the journalism that the Guardian Observer does isn't even in the newspaper. You know, we do interactive journalism, we do live blogs, we do audio, we do video, we do data graphics. We do an enormous amount of journalism that is no longer reliant on newsprint to be delivered to our readers. So I think it's really critical that we accept that the economic model for newspapers is very challenged, but the model for journalism isn't broken, and we have to find a way, which Mark will talk about, of getting it to people through different platforms. And you know, all of our journalism is now increasingly available and read far more via apps, via Facebook, via Twitter, via all manner of social media than it is via newsprint. So you know, I think that's critical. And one other thing I would say is that, you know, I get a little bit tired about people highlighting how difficult the environment is for newspapers alone. The digital revolution is not something that highlighted newspapers and said, we're going to give you a bloody hard time. You know, it's affecting everybody's life. It's affecting how high street retailers go about their business. Increasingly, everybody here is probably shopping online. It's affecting the way that we date. It's affecting the way that we learn. Universities and this city will be challenged if online tuition becomes as big as it is threatening to become. It's already started in the States with you know, really significant universities like Harvard and Princeton offering their courses free online. Now that is going to offer a massive challenge to cities that are based around the economics of a university. So you know, to talk about the digital revolution as though it is only impacting on newspapers is false. It's impacting on the way we all live, and we all are challenged to find a way through to a sustainable way of offering what we now do.
Maggie, a simple question. If you were to look back in 15 or look forward to 15 years' time, how do you think the landscape for media will be, but most particularly for newspapers?
It's a simple question, but I think it's pretty bleak, I think, for newspapers. I mean, I grew up in a house where there was always a newspaper and continued to read newspapers. I have stopped reading print, if we're talking about print, and I take John's point, you know, except at the weekends, except on Sundays, except The Guardian on Saturday. So I think my son, who's 16, I don't think he's ever bought a newspaper. So, you know, we are, if we're looking at newspapers, we are, in 15 years' time, I don't think we're going to see them. If you go to New York, it struck me recently, I didn't see a single newspaper on the tube. And similarly in Australia, where The Guardian's just opened up, it's only opened up on a digital platform. There's no newspaper. So, but I think John's point is right. It's not really about the means of delivery. It's about what we're delivering, and it's about content, and it's about new ways of content. And I think in lots of ways we can be very, very excited about the new type of content that's coming in and the impact of video and what's been offered. I am, however, really concerned about how we're going to pay for it, and really concerned about, you know, sustaining and finding that financial model that will allow us to deliver quality. Because when we stop doing that, then we may as well be, you know, go to Google for your news, go to a search engine. I think unless we can sustain the quality, then we're lost. And I think it's a really, really serious time. And it's not really print or digital. It's about journalism.
Mark, will you explain, first of all, we all know something about Storyful. Will you explain what Storyful does and how it works?
I hope we know nothing about Storyful, because if we did, then my business would be flooded with competitors. I always love the idea that no one knows what you actually do, which is great. But what it is essentially is we are a social media news agency. And what we do is we go out and we discover and verify and monetize the most valuable content that we can find on the web, on the social web. What I mean by that is all those platforms, from YouTube and the biggies like Twitter to Weibo, which is in China, or to Pinterest, or to Instagram. And the multiplicity of platforms these days itself is confusing. And what we do is we have some technology that essentially treats every news event like a community. So we see people gathering immediately something happens. Yesterday, a man in a wheelchair exploded a bomb in Beijing's airport. Within seconds, we have the photographs. Within seconds, we have the man's story. Within minutes, we have his blog post telling people about how he'd been beaten up by policemen, and that's why he was there making this protest. Now, within minutes, that's all taken down by the Chinese authorities. But we have enough time, a window, to get in there, to verify, to tell that story in a way that could never be told before. And so we go to our big clients. We have about 35 clients around the world, from the people you mentioned all the way out to NHK in Japan, and we have clients in South Africa, in Norway. And essentially, they're taking our newswire and using that to build stories. We're offering the content, the context, and they build the stories, they tell the stories, they add the value that newspapers generally and TV stations and radio stations are employed to do. What we also do is we find some content and we go to the uploaders where usually they got ripped off. You know, you used to see these videos going up on news bulletins saying credit YouTube, which is like saying credit telephone. You know, ridiculous, because the person who shot that created something of importance, sometimes an iconic image that will live for us for generations, and never got a penny, never got credit. So we've created what we think is the first ethical model for people who post news events, who aren't trained journalists, who are witnesses and accidental reporters. And we help them make money, get credit, and we also make them build money ourselves. And finally, we consult with big organizations. We're consulting with Al Jazeera America at the moment to try help them build their newsroom from scratch. And the essential principle that motivates me is that, you know, if I was saving journalism, I wouldn't start here. You know, I would just break it completely. And what I would do is I wouldn't start with the business model, because I do care deeply about the business model for journalism and trying to maintain a living for journalists. But I care more deeply about the cultural revolution, and I use that advisedly, that has overtaken us in the past 10 years. When I started as a journalist at 21 years old, I was just talking about my first assignment on top of a rooftop overlooking Mountjoy Prison in Dublin with a mobile phone the size of a sort of a telex machine. And just literally broadcasting into this phone. And that was back then. And now, you know, I have access to the most incredible range of information. The problem is, the old days, we traded in scarcity. We were the diggers, the hacks. We dug up facts and we served them to a passive audience at 9 o'clock at night or in the morning over breakfast. Today, we are the managers of this overabundance of information. 100 hours of YouTube video every single minute. Who do you look to? How do you make sense of all that? And that's where we'll have the emergence, I think, of two defined roles in journalism. Number one will be the people like me and my organization, which we will filter, and we will take the signal from all that noise and pass it on to the storytellers, the people like Maggie and John, and people like the good journalists who should have a future, and let them contextualize it, and let them give what the public will pay for and crave, which is trust, context, and a sense of giving you the tools to let you know what matters in the world and not what's being posted on Twitter right now. And that's what I would say the future is. Understand that cultural shift in the last 10, 20 years. And I think we begin to start from the right point. Try to save newspapers or its business model. We're exactly the wrong place. And more people will go out of business, will lose their jobs, and you will not be well served by that idea. So I agree with everything that's been said, but I would take it a step further.
But yet, John, when you look at newspaper figures, because actually I sometimes think that the people who write most about the demise of newspapers are newspapers. We constantly feed this notion that newspapers are gone, and it is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. And yet you look at the UK figures that you would be familiar with. Your own paper, I think, sells about 220,000 every Sunday, and this is in the print format I'm talking about. The Mail on Sunday, 1.6 million. The Sun and the Sunday Mirror, over 1 million. The Sunday Times, 840,000. Now, allowing for the fact that that is a decline from where it was, it doesn't look like it's dead.
No, I mean, I agree with everything Mark has said, and you're right, there are still upwards of 8 million people who will go out in Britain today and go to their shop and buy a newspaper of some sort. So that's a large number of people going out to make that kind of commitment. But I think hanging on to that is not going to do us any good. We have to recognize that there are whole communities of people who don't necessarily want to get their news in that format. And I don't think we should be challenged by that. I think we should be excited by that as journalists. I think we should be saying to our journalists, which we do, is 15 years ago, you told a story with a pen or a typewriter. Now you have video, you have audio. You can, a Guardian live blog on, say, the Egyptian coup of 3 weeks ago. Would have included an incredible number of rich sources. It included Twitter feeds from people on the ground. It included official statements from the government and the opposition. It included dozens and dozens of photographs where a news report might have included one. It included audio reports from people on the ground. It included film. It included Facebook reports. And of course, it included reports from our own correspondents. Now, to look at what The Guardian did with that live blog over the course of 6 or 8 hours was, in many ways, a much, much richer experience of what was happening in Cairo that morning than an 800-word piece. But the newspaper does still have a role to play, as Mark said, because 2 or 3 days later, our Foreign Affairs editor, Peter Beaumont, wrote a 2,500-word piece. And this speaks to what Mark said. There aren't that many organisations who have somebody like Peter Beaumont, who has been travelling in and around the Middle East for 30 years. And you have to look to, because what that live blog did is it instantly curated a vast amount of information was out there and presented it in a very rich way. But it was immediate. It wasn't very reflective. It wasn't very analytical. And so the newspaper was there 2 days later, and we gave it to a trustworthy source like Peter Beaumont to say, Peter, can you just explain this now? We've reported what happened, but what does it actually mean? And I think it is vital that there are places, and I don't know if there'll be newspapers, but there have to be places where figures of trust and expertise can offer that more reflective kind of view. And at the moment, those are news organisations who can do that.
Maggie, that kind of brings us on. Sorry, you were going to say, yeah.
I mean, I think what Mark said, there's a real key word here, and it is curation. Because it isn't just reflection and bringing in Peter Beaumont, who's got 20 years of experience, but actually, when you sit down, and most of us have, half an hour a day to read a newspaper, you need to know what to read, what's important, what's good, who's been through everything. So, as Mark says, there's the first process where you're bringing it all in and you're out there and you're creating from all of the stuff that's coming in. Then there's a second process where we get it down to that 37 minutes a day when people can send newspapers. Now, the thing is, I think there will always be a need for somebody that I trust to do that. And at the moment, those names are names like The Guardian and The Observer. They may well be names of Storyful, but actually that's where you see your place. Your place is helping us to do that.
And if I could go further and say the reason why I did what I did to begin with was because I really enjoyed my job. It was an honour, particularly with foreign correspondency, to go. And Maggie knows this. When you go to a place like Sarajevo back in the day, but also more recently Iraq and Afghanistan, you would be stuck there and you would be burdened by all these news gathering tools you had. So I remember going to Iraq in 2003 with €9,000 excess baggage bill before I even got on the plane for chemical weapon kits and edit packs and phones of all kinds. And we got there, 2 cars, had to be 2 cars in case one broke down, going along with, to basically go to live shots and stand there like an idiot, basically with an earpiece in your ear waiting, right? I remember one time being in southern Lebanon in 2006, and we all sat on this hotel rooftop, and some of them were, drinking beer, and we were waiting away, and at 5 o'clock there was always a volley of Hezbollah rockets out. And then there was always an Israeli response, and it was great television. And that was the job done for the day. Instead of getting in a car and going out after the Red Cross, or spending, as a good foreign correspondent would do, a lot of time contextualizing, we were locked into this breaking news model. That's over. That's the thing I think that I'll be happy to see go. When you have flashing graphics on Sky News or BBC or Fox News saying, we've got something. Well, the internet had it 5 minutes ago, and we're already analysing and verifying that data. Don't worry about it. I'll give you one final example. I'm sorry to sound like an old fart here, but in Columbine, my first big gruesome tragedy story I covered, where we stood in a car park in this terrible shooting, if you remember, 13 people were killed by their classmates. And it was the first really terribly iconic tragedy of its kind. And there was 60 journalists chasing kids, survivors, to get this soundbite. And you're thinking, what? That's ridiculous. And I remember being deeply disgusted walking away from that story. Last year, the Aurora shootings in Colorado, equally terrible, tragic situation, very close by. We were in Dublin covering the first videos emerging from that story, verifying, passing on to Good Morning America so they could make an item out of it. We stood back, we verified, we analysed. We did a far more effective job than I remember doing when I was on the ground as a foreign correspondent. That's the dirty secret about this change. It may actually be better for foreign correspondents to give you the context and not to be stuck in a hotel rooftop looking at a very narrow piece of the world, taking copy down the phone from the Dublin desk or the New York desk or whatever. So, that's one of the things I think myself I'm most happy about. There's better ways to talk about the world.
Or in a nearby country watching it on television, but anyway, that's another story.
Yeah, I just want to add to something Maggie said, because I think she's absolutely right. There are skills that the journalistic profession have built up over the last 100 years, and they are absolutely about editing, verifying, contextualizing, curating. And those are skills that are, if anything, more in need now than they were before, because there's an awful lot of noise, much more noise than there was 10 or 15 years ago. And I'm not sure where those skills will be deployed. I'm not romantic about whether they continue to be deployed in newsprint. I really don't care, as long as the content is accurate content.
Do you not? Because a lot of print journalists have this, that, you know, you will take it from my dying grasp. This is the purest form. And you don't retain that, do you?
I don't know where that gets you in the end. You know, I think you can...
A dying grasp, I think, is where it gets you.
The world of the dodo, I think,
the dodo
is where it gets
I'll
you.
explain all that to you later on.
No, do.
Sorry, I should explain. It's a bird as opposed to a baby's thing that you put in their mouth. But anyway,
I was worried about that. It is perfectly fine to have a, you know, as you would say here, a graw for newspapers. I don't have any problem with that. And they still can deliver a very textual and a very special experience, particularly, I think, on the weekend. And we do our best to do our very best for newspaper readers, because after all, they're the ones who are, frankly, getting up off their arses and paying money for this stuff. The stuff online is all free. So, you know, I'm absolutely committed to giving those newsprint readers the best possible experience. But I don't think, as a journalist, you can turn your head away from the incredible opportunities you have now to tell your story in incredibly rich ways. You have far more tools, you have far more ingredients as a journalist to tell your story. So why wouldn't you grasp that? Why wouldn't you want to partake in the sort of platforms and tools that Mark has talked about?
Well, talking about the expanding platforms of newspapers brings us nicely to Guardian Films, and maybe we're going to introduce a bit of VT, which I have to say, having seen it earlier on, is quite upsetting, but it serves it makes its point very well. Maggie, will you explain first of all what Guardian Films is about, and maybe then introduce the piece of VT we're going to see?
Well, I mean, I suppose it's what would I say? I mean, I think what is for me, what's the function of journalism? I think journalism is there to make a difference and to shine a light in dark places. And I think whatever tools we do that with is what our role is, essentially, to bring people to account, to shine a light in dark places. One of the darkest places I think that exists in the world at the moment is Guantanamo Bay, as we all know, which Obama promised to shut. So there's over 100 prisoners on hunger strike there, and 45 have been force-fed. So how on earth do you cover this sort of that experience? And thought about this for quite some time, and then Al Jazeera got a leaked document from the Southern Command at Military Command, who actually controlled Guantanamo Bay, and the freelance journalist who leaked it then became available. So reading this document is called Standard Operational Procedure, which is the procedure by which somebody is force-fed at Guantanamo Bay. And I just thought, again, it's about accountability. A democratic society like the United States is carrying out this against all the humanitarian rules, human rights. So what is it like to be force-fed? Well, the US military have given us a document. So as journalists, do we have a role to actually explain this? And if we can't get access to do it, how do we do it? So this is basically a reconstruction of what it's like to be force-fed at Guantanamo. Some people may find it upsetting. It's a volunteer who's called Mos Def, who's a very famous US rap artist. The reason why he's done it is because we wanted to get it out there as much as possible. Because Mos Def did it, over 6 million people have actually watched this video, a whole new audience to see what happens with force feeding. So is that stretching the limits of journalism too far? There certainly was a very healthy debate in The Guardian about were we taking things too far. Be interested to see what people say here. But it's very short, it's 3 minutes.
Okay. Dave a second to work on
Yeah,
that.
sure.
Maggie, just one of the things again, and it goes back to probably the point that Mark was making, and your time in Sarajevo. And I know we can sometimes be accused of being cold on these things, and we see things in terms of how you get out the story rather than the awful cruelty and the atrocities that are being inflicted. But do you look back now? I know you don't have to turn around, but do you look back now and say, my God, I wish I had all the facilities that the current journalist has, the modern journalist has, as opposed to waiting to try and get feed time to try and smuggle content out?
Well, I know we're all agreeing with each other on this platform in a very nice way, and I agree with what Mark says, but I actually do agree with what Mark says. When I went to Bosnia, which was 20 years ago, I didn't have a mobile phone. I can't believe it. And actually, some of the best stories were done when I would say to Paul Webster, who's now deputy editor of The Observer, I remember him saying to me, there's thousands and thousands of people coming from somewhere, and we don't know why. Can you go and find out? And so I went off on a journey that took nearly 4 days. And the thing is, I didn't have to answer the phone. I didn't have to live feed. I didn't have to do anything. And at the end of that, you know, I discovered a lot about what was happening to people and the camps and all of that. Now, the thing was, I was expected to disappear. They were getting a bit worried after 4 days, but I literally did disappear, and I was a journalist. 5 years later, I was in Haiti, still trying to be a print journalist and still trying to recover what was happening there. And on the next balcony to me, there was a guy from ABC News. And I remember leaving my hotel room and going out to find out what was happening and hearing this guy saying, this is Mark Phillips, ABC News, reporting from Port-au-Prince. And behind him was this beautiful vista of Port-au-Prince. I went back at lunchtime to get something, and he was saying, this is Mark so-and-so from ABC News in Port-au-Prince. And I went back at 6 o'clock, and he had never moved off the balcony the whole day. And I just thought to myself, that's the end of journalism. You know, it's like, it looks great, ABC's got their man there, and it's all about what Mark's saying, it's all about show. We do all this just so we're standing in front of the right building, and that's when we needed to do something new. So do you see what I mean? Like,
if he bought a backdrop, he needn't have left home at all then, basically.
You know, exactly. And that's what it became. And it's even worse now because you're supposed to tweet, you're supposed to do... So it's very hard to get back to that core journalism. So certainly... But there's still a place for it. There's still a place for that analysis.
But it could work together beautifully. I mean,
It can.
I remember the day when,
and it's very exciting.
when
I think we
Osama
should
bin
be
Laden
excited.
was killed. I mean, Nick Schifrin is one
I'm
of
just
our
frightened
greatest.
beyond belief. I'm not excited, but anyway.
Yeah, but I mean, get over the fear. Come and talk to us. Embrace us here. you
Can
know?
we come back to...
Well, I'll just give you one practical example.
I thought you were going to say, can I just give you one hug?
I will. I think we're at that point. I feel your pain. But I think, you know, we had ABC News as our client. Osama bin Laden is killed. We know that. We know there's a man who's witnessed this, a guy called Really Virtually on Twitter. Nick Schifrin is the ABC correspondent who's in Islamabad at the time. We guide him in using all of the tweets and the video that we've geolocated. We've got Google Earth, Google Maps. We can say that's where the compound is. Google themselves released the wrong location for the compound. We're able to tell them exactly where it is on the basis of geolocating all the tweets, the image, the video, the backdrop, Google Street View, and he arrives there and he's the first correspondent. He then puts out his own tweets, his own video, and suddenly that becomes in itself something that adds to the story in real time. You know, so suddenly, from an office block overlooking Sheriff Street in Dublin, right, with 3 people on that morning, to Nick Schifrin with his GPS in Abbottabad. That's the new reality. That's what's so beautiful about it, you know. And I think ultimately for me, I've got, you know, tons of those stories that we're working on at the moment where, you know, Channel 4 did a documentary, beautiful documentary. When I say beautiful, I say in journalistic terms, called Serious Execution Machine. Horrible documentary in another context. But they chucked us 70 videos and said, you've got 3 days to verify basic details here. Come back to us. If you cannot stand over them, we won't use them. And we went back and we had 6 or 7 that we had beyond verifiable doubt. They were definitely what they said they were. They showed what they said, and we had people to back it up. And that's the new partnership. And we went out and we asked other people to say, you know, that we knew we respected. Is that an Aleppo accent or a Damascus accent? Did this actually happen? Was that river in the background? It's summertime. Is that still in full flow? And this is the level of journalism. And finally, I would say on this is that that's the beauty of this. It's old values, traditional old journalism, just in a new kind of box, which is a liberating force, I think, for people like Nick Schifrin on the ground. And Maggie was back in the field. Hopefully we'll be working with people like Maggie to help her go and do her 3-day trek for understanding. That's why I think this is a great time to be a journalist.
Let's talk about disturbing video. I think we are ready to have a look at the Guantanamo piece now.
Peace. My name is Yassine Bey, and I'm here today to demonstrate the standard operating procedure for force-feeding detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Good morning.
Please, don't. No, please, stop it, please, stop. That's just me, please stop, I can't do it anymore.
I really want to thank you guys for setting this up and even having the idea to do it. I really didn't know what to expect. I remember tubing and the first part of it is not that bad, but then you get this burning. I got this burning. And then it just starts to be like really unbearable. It feels like something was going into my brain, and it started to reach to the back of my throat, and I really couldn't take it. My name is Yassine Bey, and I've just taken part in a demonstration with standard operating procedure for force-feeding detainees at Guantanamo Bay. Peace and good morning.
Everybody up on Sunday morning? Light entertainment.
I'm sure we could have the same debate here, but tell us what the debate was internally with that.
Well, I mean, it's like any debate. You know, we're moving from newspapers, we're moving into video. How far do you go? When is journalism journalism? We just did an animation of executions in Iran because there's no other way to tell that story. So with every new step, you have to sort of ask yourself, what are the boundaries? What are we trying to achieve here? What does this illuminate? Does this shine a light in dark places? Are there other ways to do it? So lots of people didn't. I mean, I'd say quite a lot of the senior management team were uncomfortable with it, the editor, Alan Rusbridger, wasn't. He felt it did shine a light, but it could definitely have. We talked about it in theoretical terms, but nobody knew. And in the end, we decided to take a look at it when we were finished because it was into a new area. So, it's like we're all pushing boundaries. I think as long as it has integrity, as long as it's honest.
And it's a correct representation of what you know to be true.
Yeah, and I was uncomfortable with it too. I was thinking, should he really be shouting that much? Maybe is he overdoing it? And then I had to interrogate the people who were there. I wasn't there, but somebody who works with me was. We have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve here? And is it honest? And does it have a purpose?
John, I heard you talking yesterday with Pat Kenny. You said that within, I think, about 3 to 4 years, digital revenue will outstrip print revenue. Is that correct? Is that the print revenue is falling so fast, or
No, I mean, we don't have long enough to interrogate the figures specifically, but in broad terms, what the Guardian and Observer group describe as digital revenues are projected to exceed the revenues we get from newsprint in about 5 years. Without really boring you, when you break the digital revenues down, some of those are specific to advertising sales online, digitally. Some of the other money in that digital pot are things like our Soulmates dating online service. Some of them are syndication revenues. Some of them are subscription revenues. So yes, if you describe digital revenues as other than just the money you make from advertising online, that is projected to exceed newsprint revenues within about 5 years. If you talk specifically about the money you make from advertising online, no. So, I mean, without getting into a tortuous description, the broad message is that digital revenues are offsetting the losses we're making in newsprint.
You're still losing money, though, are you not?
I'd certainly
And I don't say this with any smugness, because we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, no, we are. I liked your introductory note about John Mulholland, the bookmaker, because I'd certainly be making more money as a bookmaker, and probably the Guardian and Observer would be as well. We are, but we also cut our losses by a very significant amount of money over the last 12 months, and in fact, the year-end results we just published were incredibly cheery, and we're in the incredible position of being overseen by a trust, which means we aren't having to drive profits. It's a not-for-profit organisation, and that allows us the time to try and make what is going to be an incredibly difficult and challenging transition to a place where we're...
And you retain, I mean, I read a story overnight where the London Independent has shed so many of its foreign correspondents. To say they're down to the bone, I think does a discredit to bone, but they're somewhere beyond that. You guys continue to invest particularly in foreign coverage and in balanced foreign, and having your own people there. And I think probably that, to me, is the greatest strength of both the Guardian and the Observer. That must be very difficult to maintain that when the money people are telling you a different story, even in a trust.
Yes, but Alan Rusbridge is the editor-in-chief, and he recognises that without that, the Guardian Observer is nothing. I think it leads on to an interesting point, because up till now what we've been talking about is how we cover stories digitally in reactive terms. And I think Mark's organisation, Storyful, is brilliant, and I was hoping he would tell us about the shadow analysis they do on photographs to verify whether that picture could have been taken at that time, with that climate, in that place, at that time of day. It's just remarkable. But we are talking in broad terms about reacting to stories. Now, we also need big news organisations to create the news. And if you look at what The Guardian and Observer have done over the last 5 years, most recently, of course, we've broken the story from the whistleblower Edward Snowden about state surveillance in America. We, as an organisation, have broken the story about phone hacking and the nexus of politicians, press and police, and how close they got in Britain. And those trials will start in a couple of months. They collaborated, The Guardian, with WikiLeaks to expose all kinds of diplomatic secrets. The Observer earlier this year ran a story about the sexual misconduct of the Scottish Cardinal, and he was forced to resign. Those are an incredible bouquet of news stories, and that isn't about reacting to something that's happening in Cairo or Aleppo. That's about going out and having the kind of investment that you talk about and the time to give to journalists to find these stories and to do, as Maggie says, to uncover things that some people would rather were kept quiet.
And isn't, Maggie, even in talking for a little while beforehand, really this is getting to the essence of what we're talking about, that a lot of the time journalists get preoccupied about what platform their content is going to go up on, and there's more questioning of the platform than the content. And the reality is we had it here with the Anglo-Irish tapes. Now, they appear to have done nothing, only talked on the phone, because we've had stories every day of the week since it is beginning to lose its appeal, perhaps. But there was such a great bounce off that. Everybody was talking about what was on that, the Snowden, Bradley Manning, WikiLeaks, all of that. When you have a good story, that's still going to sell, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the big Guardian America was a huge investment, and you know, the thing is, how did you distinguish yourself? What is the Guardian going to America to say? It's going to America to say we have a different voice. We will speak louder. We will tell the stories that in a way other U.S. media organisations haven't told. And the reason why we got Snowden is because there was a sense within the whistleblower, certainly from the whistleblower, that actually the New York Times would sit on this, or the Washington Post would sit on this. And there is a sort of innate conservatism, I think, having made 18 films in Iraq, about how the American media institutions actually scrutinise their own authorities. There's a real close relationship between the journalists, the high-level journalists, and the establishment. So the Guardian was going there to say, we need to find our voice, we need to say something different. And in the end, they did find their voice. And Greenwald, who was an American journalist, broke that story with Snowden. So it was really electrifying. It was one of the most exciting high points of the last year when that happened, because that was saying the Guardian has a voice in America that is saying something different and something more than you will hear in the US media. And you know what? When we start to lose that voice, when we stop pushing those things and saying those things, and when we stop doing that journalism, then I think it's over, really.
But there is a terrible contradiction here. I hate to be the one to bring it up, but I mean, The Guardian is doing incredible numbers in the States now, in Australia, the Snowden story. Daily Mail, biggest online site in the world. Now, would you put the journalism against them? No way, obviously not. And it just speaks to something differently, which is this, that the Baghdad Bureau never made money. Never. Good, serious journalism by itself never made money. It built the reputation and the long-term success of organisations. I'd still bet on The Guardian in the long term, but in the short term, it doesn't make money. So we just got to be prepared to remember that. That has been the way since, you know, time immemorial. Serious journalism on its own did not bring in the revenue dollars. The advertising rates on a good, serious piece of video like that probably are way down on what they are for a cat falling down the toilet. And the thing I would say to you is this: that's not a bad thing, to be quite honest, because if we accept that, then we forget about the business model for serious journalism. I don't remember getting classes in the serious business model journalism
Mark, but
model.
to be fine, the problem is we can't forget about that.
Let me finish. One thing is, in the old days, what happened was the classified advertising made the money.
Yeah.
The magazine made the money. The sponsored sections on food, travel, the things that grew communities. And now there's an easier and a better chance for a community to grow around the work of your gardening correspondent, the local GAA club. Now people can be interactive. There's much more content being circulated. And for me, that's where all the money will be made. We make money, and I won't put any secret on this, from getting some of those viral videos. And we go to the uploader and say, we'll get you 10 million views because we'll put it out to all these newspapers, and we do. And we then share all the revenue between us all, and we're all very happy. And then it allows my guys to go and spend 6 hours analysing one video from Aleppo. That's the way this will work. And it always has worked that way, you know? Don't for any moment think that newspapers were making money out of the Baghdad Bureau. They were not. They were making money out of cartoons and food and travel, and they will always do that.
It's like showbiz. You have to do the Red Hurley concerts to have the ballet.
Do you know what? We should get a T-shirt. We call it cake and broccoli. That's our kind of, we talk about cake and broccoli. And that reflects most people's sort of consumption of media, I think, under 35 now.
But, and again, coming back to the newspaper side of things, John, I mean, the biggest problem, certainly on this island, is not the circulation, although that's not great. It's the fall off in advertising off the edge of a cliff. That is the one that's going to, Mark talks about all of the old reliables on this. They're gone and they won't be coming back. I mean, in a local context where, well, property is gone because, you know, to make what you will, that's another discussion for another day. But even cars and classified advertising and all the rest, that's all gone. And with the cycle that we're in, you know, most things will come back, but that won't.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, Mark's absolutely right. The Guardian basically for years lived off a massive classified advertising model, which was built around 4 days of the week, Monday to Thursday. Monday was media jobs. I edited the media section in The Guardian about 100 years ago, and we had, I think, 50 pages of ads every day, every Monday. Tuesday was social workers, big readers of The Guardian, another 50 pages of advertising. Wednesday was teaching, and Thursday was, I think, kind of computing. You'd be lucky now if any of those sections carry more than 5 or 6 pages a day. I mean, obviously, that market has no place in print. But interestingly, and Mark again is right, you have to try and build those communities digitally. And for the first time this year, The Guardian's recruitment advertising digitally is growing relatively significantly. But the other thing I would say is, one of the reasons not to hold on to the grow of newspapers for too long is, beautiful though they are as an experience, and I grew up reading The Observer as a 14-year-old in Dublin, and I used to go to early mass so I could go and play football, and I'd buy it on the way in, and our local church is a massive church, and I'd sit right at the back, and if you positioned yourself behind the pillars, you could both be at mass and have a good read at the same time. And no one was the wiser. Now, I still remember Adrian Hamilton and Conor Cruise O'Brien and all that. But there are huge costs associated with getting a newspaper out to every shop in Britain. I mean, from 8 o'clock last night to 5 o'clock this morning, we will have got The Observer to something like 50,000 shops across Britain. Now, that starts to feel a bit Victorian when, at a click of a button, more of the journalism is available in a much richer experience.
Including the things that happen through the night.
So the answer, and I wouldn't, you wouldn't want this to be a headline, but the answer will be that at some point, newspapers probably will die. They might die during the week first, and there might be a single edition over the weekend, which is luxurious and quite pricey. And with that, you lose an awful lot of the costs that are associated with newspapers. The costs of the newsprint, 4 or 5 years ago, it escalated, and you don't have any control over global newsprint prices. The cost of lugging this thing onto trucks and trains and getting them to 50,000 shops across the UK every day. At some point, that's all going to go. And the dream would be that the revenues you get digitally will support a much leaner organisation, which is almost specifically dedicated just to the journalism, not necessarily to all the...
Can I ask you what probably is a very unfair question? Do you think you'll be the last editor of the Print Observer?
Well, if I got fired next week, no, there would be another one.
Depending on your answer, remember Gaff TV is here. But anyway.
Yeah. No, I have absolutely no idea. I mean, I wasn't being entirely facetious about that, actually. I mean, I consider it a privilege to be the editor of The Observer, and each week I go in thinking, quite reasonably, this could be your last one, and you want to make it the best you can. The health and the survival of The Observer will be based on a commercial decision, and when there were some question marks about it 3 or 4 years ago, the point that I made to the Guardian and Observer Trust was, let's not make this a decision that's based on philosophy about whether you think it would be better to just have a Guardian or whether it would feel better not to have a sort of annoying second brand. What I said to them was, let's do the figures, let's do the research, and if it is shown that commercially you would be better placed to have The Observer on a Sunday, let's keep it. And I had a little tussle, and we all spoke our mind, and we went away and did the work, and we did research groups all around the country, and lo and behold, it was proved that it was a commercially beneficial decision to keep The Observer. At some point, that won't hold true. And I'm
But
perfectly
is that part of the
reasonable.
problem here? We're presented with these mutually exclusive choices. It's going to be print or it's going to be online. But in fact, if everybody stopped just talking for a moment and looked at what's actually working, when you bundle digital subscription in with print subscription, it works. So you say to somebody, listen, you're going to pay $10 for the New York Times. You can either pick it up as your newspaper physically on a Sunday, or you can just get it online. We don't care. We're agnostic. If in the end of the day there's no demand for the print edition, it'll go. I would suggest it will stay on a Saturday and Sunday, and during the week we might stop printing on a Tuesday or Wednesday. I certainly think local papers will do this.
But do you know, Mark, anybody under 30 that buys a newspaper?
Well, I'll give you a story. Like my daughter, I look at her again, and I say this all the time to people I'm talking to them. Forget about the iPad, and I think it's a great piece of technology. I'm obsessed with it because I want to find out how it works. She doesn't think like that. It's a limb, It's just an extension of her hand. And if you watch the way tactile she works and she views media on that, it's wondrous. And there's a joke a friend of mine tells it, and I don't know if I believe it or not, but his 18-year-old goes up to the television and starts swiping it. Daddy, broken. And, I just think that we have to look at the way in which not just, people consume through their eyes, but also they feel the media and the multimedia stories that are building up. For example, recently The Guardian Australia did an incredible job on telling the stories of wildfires in Tasmania. New York Times recently did something similar about an avalanche in the Rockies. And again, appealing to this notion that now stories You know, that's what we're talking about here, storytelling.
Yeah, but the thing, Mark,
change.
I mean, for example, the Australian thing, we know, I mean, that cost over £50,000.
Yeah.
That's the kind of cost. The thing it's all going to come down to the debate that's going on all the time, and you feel it in The Guardian and the Observer all the time, is paying. If you want the stuff, if you want quality, if you want newspapers broken, if you want governments challenged, if you want prisons thrown open, we have to pay. I believe, I'm not speaking for The Guardian here, you know, and certainly that isn't the position of The Guardian,
But there are things
the editor.
there are things that you can pay for and people will pay for. And while we still quote these figures, about 3-4% say they will only pay for stuff, in reality, they are starting to pay for the premium.
Yes.
The cream of what you do. There's a lot of stuff that you won't be able to pay for. Your breaking news sections, your live blogs, for example, maybe sponsorship might support them, but they're not going to be money makers. So it's thinking, where is the value, not the profit. And where's the value for a newspaper? The value for a newspaper is storytelling. It's not about just flashing up breaking news in front of you, doing what everyone else is doing. It's doing something that's added value. I get the Observer and the Financial Times, and I will read them online, and then I'll go to the shop if I feel I'm going to have a better experience from reading it in a magazine. And I think essentially I'll pay for that.
But would you not, I mean, how much do you think, and I'll ask this to anyone that wants to answer it, how much do you think people are prepared to pay for this? Because we have a model for far too long now where if you go onto your laptop, all of the websites there and all of the websites are free. Fine if you want to buy the app version of The Observer and The Guardian, or you want to, for any of the number of news services and that. But if people are used to getting something for nothing, I mean, the Irish Times have tried the paywall, have taken down the paywall. Others have tried the same thing. Fine if you're the Wall Street Journal, because it is very definitely a premium product you're not going to find somewhere else. Do you think people are prepared to pay in the future for something they're getting for free now?
Newspaper groups in the United States, for example, you'll see newspaper groups now buying TV stations and they meld them together. So it doesn't become TV, print or radio. It's just one thing. It's called media, right? And what they're trying to toy with is the idea of having specific high interest niches that people want to hear about, like cars and TVs and, you know, it may be luxury travel, whatever it may be, or local football club. And this is where people are starting to actually pay. And what they're doing is they may be only 40,000 people, but they spend more time on your site, they spend more time using your product, and that's what advertisers want. They don't want 30 seconds for 10 million people hitting that video. They want lots of people at a very high demographic group coming along and spending time with you. And that's the new behavior that the most pioneering media are developing. And you know, don't tell me that just because now this exists, you know, there's a famous principle in physics, the Heisenberg principle, that you never, you know, the act of observing the object changes the nature of it. You should be watching its momentum. I would be saying to you, look 5 years ahead. Where do you want to be as a newspaper? But don't come here and cry and tell me that, well, they won't pay for it. Innovate, change, and if you have to, fail. And that's one thing newspapers and journalists are never good at. We're so full of our own, you know, exactitude that we just fear failure. And I think the newspaper business, like any business in disruption, has to innovate, and part of innovation is making a fool of yourself sometimes and trying something that doesn't work and then changing around. And in the end, somewhere in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we'll find a multitude of different solutions for different organizations. It won't just be two things, circulation, advertising. It's going to be a lot of different things, but we'll need to innovate. And at the moment, I spend too many times going to conferences where people sit there and go, oh my God, what's happening to newspapers? While I know when I go to clients all over the world, there's some incredible stuff going on behind the scenes that will roll out that I think will change.
Yeah, I think it's almost a diversion to think about, you know, whether they're going to pay or not. You know, at the moment, they're not, so we just need to get on with it, really. There might come a day where they will, but I'm not convinced about that. And I think Mark is right, you do have to innovate. And if you look at the example of Guardian Australia, which is a part of the Guardian journalistic offering, which is principally about reporting Australia to Australians. It's not that we've suddenly discovered an incredible interest in Australia, with all due respect to Australia, but it's actually about going to Australia and bringing liberal journalism to Australia and to Australians. Now, what the Guardian have done is they've teamed up with a liberal philanthropist, split 50-50. Now, that's unthinkable 5 years ago that would have happened, and it's exactly the kind of thing that Mark is talking about. We have to start thinking kind of outside the box a little
And that's
bit.
fine when you talk about a liberal philanthropist, because that obviously would fit in, I guess, with the ethos of The Guardian. But I know, Mark, you in particular, in fact, all of you would know this model in the States, where so much of investigative journalism is now down to philanthropists who presumably come from some perspective on this thing. It'd be great to think that they love investigative journalism, but it's often to bring down forces or to change ways. Maggie, do you think that's a very unhealthy way to move?
I mean, no, because actually that's the way we've been moving for the last I mean, the money, the films that I make, not this one, but the films that we make, and much of it can come from outside funders or philanthropists. I mean, we just had to sort of get real and move on and say, actually, we have to explore new models. So I would say I spend 60% of my time, in reality, raising money. Because, you know, I'm a journalist, but the reality of the situation, how it all pans out, we don't know. What I see in the sort of television world is that there has been a decline in quality television, quality investigations because of costs, and they're looking for sponsorship, and they're looking for brand partnerships. We're all going to go that way, and we're all going to find different ways of doing it. One of the ways I think we will also find is asking people to pay and recognising the value. But you have to be careful. You know, it's great when we could sort of say we're being funded by millions of pounds of ads from cars and from classifieds and from whatever. That's not happening anymore. So where can we have relationships? So we have a very sort of strict contract. We will suggest things. We're working with a group called Humanity International at the moment to do 2 investigations into slavery in Peru and slavery into the shrimps or to the prawns that you're eating. You know, looking at what's happening to the people in those markets where people are being killed and people are being tortured. So the funding is coming from Humanity United. We sit down, we have a conversation with them, and we say, we want to make these stories, we think they're important. They're partly funding them. And then they sign off on them editorially. I don't have them in the edit suite. I don't have them telling me who to interview. But it's a dangerous area we're going into because, you know, they are controlling the economic base and they'll try and have some input into the infrastructure, and we have to guard against it getting out of hand. And it's not as cosy as it used to be when we didn't have to think about budgets, but that's life.
No more dangerous than Dennis O'Brien owning half of the media, I guess, you know. But anyway, I want to open it up to the floor because we only have about 15 minutes or so left. Maybe we could take the lights up, and I think we have a microphone or two if anybody has anything that they want to say. Can we take up the lights a small bit so that we can? We'll have one question in the dark before the lights come up.
Hello, how you doing? I liked the discussion about money that was sparked off by Mark's contribution earlier. And I think in the context of this week, where a major report on the future funding of public service broadcasting in Ireland was published, and if you read the report, the tenor of it is entirely about the bean counters and audience reach. Hardly a word about content or culture or anything like that. It's all about how we can make public service broadcasting as cheap as possible. There's even talk about reviving the cap on advertising. Last heard of when Ray Burke tried to nobble RTE all those years ago. And I just think that the climate for discussion of the media in Ireland is controlled, or at least dominated, by a Thatcherite model that holds sway, where accountants and bean counters seem to think that they know what's best. And that's the kind of debate, far more so than whether newspapers are going to survive or wither away, that we need to have in this country. It's, you know, is public service broadcasting or public service media accurate, fair, independent media? Is it valuable, and how as a people are we going to ensure that it survives? Thanks.
Okay, anybody want to take
I mean, as a former public service broadcaster, it constantly annoyed me that whenever I would do a show that I thought was worthwhile, we'd be up against Champions League or we'd be up against Schwarzenegger in the latest movie on Network 2, and that's all people worried about at the end of the day, because, well, we're going to do 400,000 people tonight, and that's going to be a bad drop, and that's going to mean that the executive board are going to look at prime time and say, woo, ratings are dropping. And suddenly, you know, that's not something I should be thinking about, you know. So what I would say is, my personal belief is that the license fee, the way it's divided up, is crazy. You know, I don't think you should be funding Champions League or the latest acquisitions of reality television from America, you know, as the public. I think there's a public utility within RTE that does a really, really good job, but it's hampered not by a Thatcherite ideology necessarily, but by this idea that current affairs and public service broadcasting in its truest form is competing with reality television, and you need to take it out of that context. So what I would say, smaller license fee, funding like the Channel 4 model, a public service news and current affairs department, perhaps sport as well, and let the rest of RTE compete on an equal footing with everybody else for the other stuff. And right now, this bizarre model of license fee and advertising, crazy. So I do agree with you to a certain extent. And it just meant crazy stuff. I remember going to Afghanistan, filming an interview with the most senior policewoman in Afghanistan in Kandahar. And it was the most amazing story I ever did in my life. And we got 2 minutes on prime time because, you know, another domestic story was on and they told us we don't have the time. That's just crazy that stuff's happening. So I do agree with you.
Is there any case, and maybe John, I might ask you this, to be made for public funding of newspapers, or that a slice of that money should go? I mean, if you talk about public service, and you know, let's get away from the notion that we're lining Tony O'Reilly's pocket or Dennis O'Brien's pocket or whoever it would be. You take, God, I'd love if we got some of it ourselves. We're a small, independently with a small I newspaper, struggling to survive, covering all of the stuff like the courts and the council and local democracy and all the rest of that. Surely there's as much public service in that as there is in what a television station will do.
Yeah, I think the French have tried this in the last 5 years, and there is some kind of public fund, and they're in a slightly different position, I think, because they have a particular interest in preserving French culture generally. I don't know. Asking the public to pay, I mean, the BBC gets into a terrific amount of difficulty because it is accepting a large amount of money from Britons, and it becomes a political football, and increasingly so when the purse strings are so tight. I'm not sure that newspapers would want to place themselves in a position where they were having to answer for decisions they were making politically, because that public fund would presumably have oversight from politicians. Yeah. And you know, the great thing about newspapers in Britain, and love them or loathe them, is that there is a terrific range from fairly sectarian and ideological on the one hand, relatively middle of the road. They come from the right, they come from the left, they're brazen, they're noisy, they're intellectual, they're brainy, they're colourful, they're sober. I think you want to try and keep that mix, and I think it's up to us to find a way of convincing people, whether it's readers to pay or whether it's advertisers to collaborate in different ways, or philanthropists, rather than going to the public and say, you know what, we're bust, help us out. I'm not sure about that.
That's my plan B gone then. Anybody else out there that has a question for us? Right at the front, and then...
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question, probably from Mark and yourself, Dave, that where do you think Irish media stand now with respect to using new tools and technologies? And how important do you think for the Irish media to embrace these tools? One of the reasons that I'm asking this is because we are running the first Irish national survey, the first national survey on Irish journalists' use of social media. And it was surprising to me that no such study has been done in Ireland, firstly, because like in the UK and in Europe and globally, we've had these sort of studies from 2009 and 2010. And another point that Mark mentioned here is that, yes, one of the reasons I think that Irish media is not much willing to use it because they don't think it is much important, because it is a lot of international news covered on the social media, for example. And should it change for the Irish media to survive or to improve, or not?
I'll let Mark go first.
Yeah, great question. I mean, I've attempted to work with some Irish news organisations, and you just give up after a couple of months, because essentially what we're good at right now is a global news wire, and that's, to be quite honest, not something that's going to make money for the Irish newspaper. I think generally Irish journalists are no worse, no better, probably better actually, than most of their continental counterparts. I was recently in Italy and Germany and Austria, where they banned the use of Twitter on TV. It's crazy. So Irish people, actually Irish journalists, are ahead generally of Europe, but certainly way behind the United States. And the final point I would make is that what really is frustrating for me is it's actually local journalism, covering the town hall or the local courts. That's where actually social media could be strongest, because there are motivated individuals in every community that now have the ability to join the process of reporting. And I think way too little attention is given by us into developing hyper-local models of journalism, which will be primarily online and primarily social. And so that's where I think I'm most frustrated. I think Ireland is a perfect test case, because we are so connected. We all have mobile devices. We're talkers. We want our opinion to be heard. And I just bemoan the fact that we don't look local rather than international. So I would give Ireland a B+.
I'm surprised to hear it, because I would have thought that we're certainly, we may not be Luddites, but I wouldn't call us advocates for this for the most part. And I think it always comes back to 2 points. Where's the money is the main one that comes back to. And secondly, let the bigger organisations do this first, and let's see how we get on after that, and we see can we hang on to their coattails on it. I just think we're terribly reluctant that if we can't see, and it's great to hear, I knew in the panel that we had this morning that we had advocates for all of that new digital media. I just sense a huge reluctance to move away from the print and paid for model. We talk about it and say we will embrace it, but it was Thomas Aquinas, not yet. At some stage in the future, if we have to, we will do this. But I just sense a huge reluctance. It's funny when you mention City Hall. I know a journalist in Cork who covers the City Hall meetings, and he ends up with Cork City Hall trending while the meeting is going on. Now, good for him, because I've covered those meetings, and not if I was making it up could I make this thing trend. But you're right, in that context, it certainly does work. But I just think we are very reluctant, and it's to our shame that we are, because it's almost, again, like we are clinging to something that's
one thing I would say to The Guardian, by the way, and I think the New York Times has done this, is public available data is growing at an exponential rate, and we need people to get in there and start working out what that all means. So people releasing all of the records of the county council in relation to planning and zoning, etc. We need people who are trained as data journalists to go in and make sense of that. And actually, that's a great way for you guys to take part, is to start looking at all this big amount of public information about your communities, your schools, your councils, and start trying to make sense of it. Go to people like The Guardian, who are particularly good at data journalism. This is an area I think that's going to be tremendously important to engage all of you, who every single one person in this audience is expert at some subject, above all the other 5 billion people on the planet, right? So we have to engage with the experts, and at some point in your life, you will be that person. And I hope to God you can talk to a journalist, and that's the future of journalism for me, and that starts locally rather than starting at the level of Sarajevo or Aleppo or Damascus. It starts Galway.
John, you wanted to say?
Yeah, because I started talking in terms of making a distinction between newsprint and journalism, and I think that's where you arrive back, because as a news organisation, you have to live in the way that your consumers are living. And at The Guardian and Observer, we talk about being committed to open journalism and to digital journalism, but the open bit is as important. And what that means is that, the model of us getting up on stage and delivering to all of you a story that you have no impact on or opportunity to partake in is gone. We have to engage with people in the same way that you are engaging with people online in different communities, your whole life. And if we culturally aren't operating in the way that you are operating in your lives, we won't have a future. And that means that we can interact with communities, we can interact with experts, we can use their resource to even improve the stories that we tell. And there's lots of examples where The Guardian and Observer have used experts or citizens to either give us stories or improve the story that we've already told. And the one-way model is not going to work any longer, because you have to situate yourself in, and that's why I've got a problem with paywalls, where a paywall basically means that you're going to withdraw behind a gated community. Well, by and large, that's nice if you think it's going to work, but it's not the way people are operating on social media. It's not the way people are living their lives digitally. It is a free, open, interactive, engaged, participatory experience, and that's how you're going to have to build your journalism. Just on data, one of the most exciting parts of the Guardian website is their data blog, not as emphasized as I think sometimes it should be. One of the best things they do every September is they take all of the UK's departmental spending and they create this wonderful graphic of it. It does get printed in the paper, but the experience of accessing it online is much richer, because on the paper you just see that X amount of money is spent from the Ministry of Defence, X amount on pensions. But on the website you can click on all of those particular departments and you can drill down into just exactly how it's spent. Over 3 years, that's now become something which people actually wait for The Guardian to publish, because The Guardian get all the information available from the UK, but then they curate it, they verify it, and they present it in an incredibly rich way. And you know, if you have time, have a look at some of the incredible graphics they've done. Just one last one, they did one around the London riots to whatever it was 2 or 3 years ago, when they showed graphically where the offences were committed. And they also showed where the people had travelled from to commit those offences. So the people robbing Louis Vuitton in Oxford Street or Covent Garden didn't, funnily enough, live in Covent Garden or Oxford Street. They came from the poorest postcodes of London, and in Manchester, when they broke into the Arundel's shopping centre and robbed trainers, they, funnily enough, didn't live in the city centre. They lived in outlying, disadvantaged areas. And, you know, that was an incredibly rich way of telling a story that, on the whole, a huge percentage of people who came to do what they did during those riots came from outlying, poor districts. And, you know, so data journalism is just one way in which journalists, I'm a huge fan of the newspapers, but we have got to embrace different ways of telling our stories.